The accomplishment more than just a 4th of July spectacular.
Welcome back to Earth. That was beautiful.
Seven major record companies have already signed up to produce on the system.
"1982 was a great year for film with many successful releases. But it was also a strange year where certain films would not perform too well in terms of financial success, critic reviews, and audience reception. That's of course not strange on its own, but what is strange is that some of these films went on to become popular and considered masterpieces of cinema. Marty McFly really puts it best.
Guess you guys aren't ready for that yet. But your kids are gonna love it.
Take the king of comedy as an example. Robert De Niro and Martin Scorsese had become quite the duo, especially with Taxi Driver. They later went on to do Raging Bull together. It was not a commercial success when accounting for a film's marketing budget and a percentage of the profit that goes to the movie theatres. It did however win awards and was considered a great film by those who saw it. So there was a good chance that future projects would be more successful. But The King of Comedy was not one of them. The film with a $19 million budget only went on to gross a total of $2.5 million at the box office.
Putting on my shirt and I'm tying, and they said, now for the flop of the year, The King of Comedy. And I said, oh, okay.
At the time, the film received decent reviews from critics but mixed impressions from audiences. Fast forward to present day, and although still not as popular as the mobster movies, it is considered a must-watch, and is even my personal favourite from Scorsese. So why did this film underperform upon release? Well, it was simply far too ahead of its time. Rupert Pupkin is an aspiring comedian who is tired of being a schmuck and wants to stand out amongst the masses.
Now, I know it's an old, hackneyed expression, but it happens to be the truth. You've got to start at the bottom.
I know, that's where I am, at the bottom.
It takes years and years and years of honing that and working it. And
there's only one problem, though, and I don't mean to interrupt you, but there's only one problem. I'm 34 years old. I'm asking if you listen to my act, that's all. If you listen to my act, then tell me what you think about it.
Now, this is obviously quite a naive perspective from Rupert. Watching a lot of entertainment and feeling inspired by it is a great start, but it doesn't necessarily make you an expert in that field. Equally, it can be upsetting when you feel ignored and those in established places are not giving you enough of a chance. Even though Rupert ends up taking this to quite the extreme, it is a frustrating position that a lot of aspiring talent can relate to in the modern day.
Boy, this is when you tell me to call you and then you don't...
I told you to call to get rid of you!
The other part of this film focuses on crazy fans and stalkers, which wasn't obsolete in the 1980s but is perhaps more understood and documented in the present day with the rise of the internet. The King of Comedy has an absurd yet brilliant finale, and the very end is quite reminiscent of Taxi Driver. Unfortunately, with audiences not being able to connect with the main themes of the film, it was difficult for this to be appreciated in the same way. I have always found Rupert's big line in this film quite amusing, because the popularity of the film itself had the complete opposite timeline.
But look, I figure it this way. Better to be king for a night than schmuck for a lifetime.
For obvious reasons, science fiction was a very popular genre in the early 80s. And June of 1982 is a fascinating month to look back at. There were three very notable films that released during this time: E.T. the Extra-Terrestrial on June 11th, and both Blade Runner and The Thing on June 25th. E.T. was an incredible success. The $10.5 million budget film went on to gross a total of $359 million at the box office, and it's now just under $800 million when accounting for re-releases. On top of commercial success, E.T. instantly became a Steven Spielberg classic. It has a fun yet emotionally uplifting story, which at the time was generally more favoured in the science fiction genre, because Blade Runner and The Thing would not see anywhere near the same success or reception at release. Blade Runner had a budget of $30 million and grossed $27 million with its initial release. In '82, the beautiful visual style received most of the praise. It both captures what a futuristic city could look like with these establishing shots, but also the grittiness of everything on the ground, looking like a classic noir film. But unfortunately, the story was not anywhere near as appreciated as it is today. However, Blade Runner is in a more unique position, where it wasn't just the consensus of the film that changed with time, but also the film itself. There are numerous versions of Blade Runner, but three main ones to keep in mind. The theatrical version was of course released in 1982. Nowadays, this version is often made fun of for its voiceover by Harrison Ford. Here's an example that takes place just after the first replicant kill of the film.
There it was again. Feeling in myself for her, for Rachel.
The delivery is not great, but more than anything it is unnecessary because Harrison Ford's superb acting tells you everything you need to know about Deckard's feelings towards the situation. And a very confusing scene in the original version is when Deckard picks up a small model of a unicorn off the floor, because this means nothing to the audience without context. The ending was also quite strange with how positive it was. Happy endings can of course be wonderful in a movie like E.T., but quite out of place in Blade Runner given the tone of the rest of the story. Fast forward a decade to 1992 and there was a director's cut of the film. Now it's important to note that despite being called the director's cut, Ridley Scott had input but not complete creative control. Regardless, it was a drastic improvement on the original. For starters, the voiceover was completely gone. There is also an added dream sequence where Deckard is dreaming about a unicorn, which now gives the model of the unicorn far more context. It brings into question whether or not Deckard is a replicant, because how else would anyone know that he has dreams about unicorns? It's the equivalent of Rachel's implanted memories. And thankfully that cheesy ending was removed. Fast forward an additional 15 years and we get Blade Runner: The Final Cut. The changes are not as significant, but Ridley Scott had more creative control and did well with polishing up a few scenes, making it now the definitive version of the film. Not only has Blade Runner become highly regarded, but it also led on to what I would argue is the best science fiction film of all time. Although that one was a flop as well. Which I suppose highlights that the Blade Runner films are niche compared to other science fiction properties such as Dune. So there is a chance the theatrical version of Blade Runner would not have performed well regardless of the film's strange choices. But people's love for these films in the modern day, how well crafted they are, how much they have to say about the world, and their greater impact on the science fiction genre is undeniable. The Thing by John Carpenter was not a successful film, making only $20 million from a $15 million budget. The film was not liked by audiences or critics. Most focused on the grotesque elements and the bleakness of the overall story. And what I find interesting about this is that Ridley Scott's Alien came out just 3 years prior in 1979, and is seen as a companion movie. They both contain a crew of people who find themselves in a difficult situation when they need to kill an alien creature, each crew member being killed off one by one. But comparatively, Alien had a much better reception at release. Perhaps one reason for this is the xenomorph in Alien is a lot more mysterious, surrounded by darkness in majority of the shots. The Thing, on the other hand, is not hidden at all.
Dean Cundey said, rightly, we're bringing this out under these lab lights, man. We're bringing it out for you to take a look at. And a lot of really upset people at the time, really upset people.
But as standards for what was deemed scary changed with the evolution of film, audiences were able to look at other aspects of the film and appreciate its quality.
At the time this movie was released, this would have been in June of '82, it was considered a very frightening and horrifying and repellent film, and now we look at it and it's kind of a straightforward, tough, hard-hitting action picture with a monster in it. Really, our concern was about the paranoia aspects of the story.
It was such a great story about that, wasn't it? 12 guys and finally knowing each other so well, and then finally getting to a point where you don't know.
As for the tone, the story is still considered bleak today, but that isn't viewed as a negative. For every film that's willing to explore darker themes, there are going to be plenty that contain a more positive tone. But with it being released so shortly after E.T., the audience didn't seem quite as on board with that in 1982.
It was a grim movie in many ways. The whole theme of it, loss of identity and the end of the human race. And I just dove right into that. Let's do that. And that didn't make the audience feel too happy at the time. They wanted something that was an up cry. And they got that with E.T., not with my film. I thought this was my best movie. Part of me thinks it is.
Perceived at the time to be a film that was, I don't know what the word is, cruel or something, but I think maybe more, it was a somber, serious film. There wasn't the kind of humor that you began to see in action movies and horror films. It wasn't jokes. We were taking the characters and the story extremely serious.
Yeah, that's right. You're right. It was in a time before that seemed to become prevalent in these kinds of scary movies, that even in the ones that you had done and when Escape from New York, where there was a little bit of humor, this one had very, very little.
Thankfully, The Thing is now regarded as a science fiction masterpiece. And many people, including myself, consider it one of the best horror movies ever made. The plot is quite out there, but it makes these characters interesting to watch. Each one reacting differently as the situation continues to escalate. On top of being a fantastic film, the conversations to be had about the story can be fascinating. There are many mysteries and different interpretations amongst fans. The leap in reception to this film is quite mind-blowing, but shows with a bit of patience a brilliant story will always be recognised. Eventually.
Wait here for a little while. See what happens.
So, what should we make of 1982 in relation to film? I'll firstly say there are many examples of this in other years. The Big Lebowski was released in 1998. It did not perform extremely well at the box office and received mixed reviews from critics, but later became a cult classic and considered essential viewing for fans of film. It's just coincidental that there are multiple examples of this in 1982. And even more coincidental that two of them were science fiction films released on the same day. Regardless, what this proves to me is that conversations surrounding films are never a done deal. There will always be new things to discover and talk about. And to me, that's kind of brilliant.